I'm Afshin Rattan. We're going underground as Trump's top diplomat, Mike Pompeo, who attacked Julian Assange of WikiLeaks when he was head of the CIA, arrives in the city that now arbitrarily deprives him of liberty. This just 24 hours after its first two prison visitors claimed Assange's life is now in danger at Britain's so-called Guantanamo prison, Belmarsh, 12 miles from this studio. Coming up on the show. After Jeremy Corbyn's promotion of this week's unprecedented report into global species extinction, we investigate how a future Labour government would promote equality at home with British Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell's economic advisor, Professor Guy Standing. And as British warship HMS Echo joins the build-up of perceived NATO nation aggression on Russia's border, we ask a former NATO ambassador if US-UK warship diplomacy could lead to a third world war. Plus, as the London Bridge attack inquests begin, we investigate the terrorism effects of NATO's catastrophic war on Libya and at the prospect of a US war on oil superpower Iran. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground, but first it's 24 hours since a 2,000-page international report drawing on 15,000 reference materials alerted the world to capitalism threatening the extinction of a quarter of all animals and plants on Earth. At the same time, ecology and equality were the hallmarks of a speech given at London's Royal Society of Arts by the economic advisor to the man chosen by Jeremy Corbyn to be his chancellor in a Labour government, John McDonnell's advisor. Professor Guy Standing joins me now. Guy, thanks so much for being in person in London instead of in Switzerland. I've got to ask you then, just even before we get to the report, why it was notable that you mentioned ecology in a presentation to the Royal Society of Arts about universal basic income.
Well, what I'm arguing in this report and in my book on basic income is that if we recall William Beveridge in 1942 in his report that became a defining document,
Gave us the NHS.
It gave us the social security system and so on. On page 2 of his report, he had one paragraph which was really important. He said, this is a time for revolutions, not tinkering. And he said that we need to slay 5 giants, right? Now, the essence of my report is that we are at a crisis point in the global transformation, the construction of a globalized system, in which we have 8 modern giants. And the question of extinction, I've put as number 7, the 7th big giant, but the one I think will tip the balance in favor of moving towards a basic income. Why? Because if you are remotely concerned about the things you've just been talking about, and you see this ecological catastrophe rushing towards us, you know very well that we've got to tackle fossil fuels, we've got to tackle greenhouse emissions, we've got to tackle air pollution. If we want to confront that giant that's facing us, we have to have much higher taxes on polluting things. But if you use the revenue from the carbon tax to pay out a common dividend to everybody.
This common dividend. Let's get on to that common dividend. The governing Tories, Nick Bowl, now on the backbenches, prominent Tory, said it's a dangerous nonsense. There seem to be big scepticism about it, a popular poll showing just 41% support of it. And most people just saying, if you give money to everyone, well, you've kind of said that we can't afford it already. But it would lead to inflation and people would become lazy.
No, the first thing is that the inflation effect is rubbish because it's one-handed economics. Basically, what you're doing is you're taking money from some other purpose that's there in order to give people a basic income. So what you're doing is recycling money that's already in the system.
But rich people keep it in the bank.
No,
rich people spend it.
No, rich people spend it on luxury goods and put it in tax havens and the rest of it, depleting our economy and our society of needed income. But if you had a commons dividend or a basic income for everybody, what you do is this. You tend to have an increase in demand for local goods and services, because lower income people spend their money locally. That generates employment, economic activity, and has a multiplier effect on the economy. So you increase demand for those goods, that increases the supply, there's no inflationary impact.
And that's a level around £5,000 each.
Well, I think the amount
A year.
Is the amount we can come back to. My own view is that we've got to start at a low level because we've got to get the funds to pay for it. And that we can come back to, but you can easily get the funds. The report discusses various ways you can do that. And then we gradually build up the level. If we abolished personal income tax allowances right now and use the money that's actually being foregone thereby to pay out every man and woman a basic income, they would get £48 a week. When they've paid their rent and they've paid their food and they've paid their gas or electricity, have £20 left for everything else at the end of the week. So if they were to get an increase of £48 without conditions, that's going to make a huge difference to them.
Well, OK, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, who said the poverty in Britain right now was a political choice and comparable to sub-Saharan Africa, you're saying this, we'd never get another UN report on Britain saying that our poverty in this country could be compared to sub-Saharan Africa, which is what he more or less said.
Philip Alston, the man you're talking about, is a personal friend. He was really shocked when he came to this country to do that report. He's written to me last week to say he hopes the report goes well.
And this would solve it at a stroke? Well,
Purposefully
presumably the
say-
malnutrition...
Well, no, I purposely say that a basic income, even if it was £100 a week or whatever, is no panacea. It's not a standalone policy. It's potentially transformative because it opens up a direction, a new direction, away from the conditionality of universal credit and all the terrifying aspects of universal credit, moves towards saying we should confront those 8 giants. We should have a different type of society in which we confront inequality, that's the first giant. We confront economic insecurity, that's the second giant. I don't think it's appreciated by enough people that across this country today, economic insecurity is a pandemic. We've gone a long way down the road to targeting on the poor, right?
Testing, means testing.
Means testing. Now, means testing means that I've got to, as a bureaucrat, identify someone who is poor, right? Only that person will get a benefit or a service or whatever it. But then if you ask, well, okay, supposing he's poor because of his own fault or because he's lazy or his drugs or the rest of it. So we have to introduce behavior testing. Once you have to, are you doing this right? Are you doing that right? Are you doing that right? Intruding into people's lives.
Computer says no.
The computer says no, and that leads to sanctions, as we've seen, and everybody who knows anything about the system, and that's why I think the politicians are being dishonest. Everybody who knows that the more you go down that road, the more people who should be receiving benefits are excluded.
Of course, you were on that podium with Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. It was Labour that pioneered subsidising top-up wages for big multinational companies so they could pay, say, supermarket checkouts less. It was Labour that supported these sorts of elements of the welfare state, tax credits, minimum wages. The minimum wage, why do we need this?
Well, you see,
Are those all failed attempts at equality?
I'm broadly in favour of the minimum wage. It sounds good. It does some good. It sets standards. But as I show in the report, remarkably few employers have been prosecuted under either Labour or Tories or the coalitions. Very few. It's easy for a clever employer to get round these systems. I want them, so don't, I'm not against a minimum wage or a fair wage or all of this stuff, but we shouldn't expect too much of it.
Well, the Liberal Democrat leader, Vince Cable, he said this kind of idea is more reminiscent of Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman. And the Tories also saying the reason why this is dangerous is that you are taking away the choice of the person and the choice of the employer.
I think the absurdity of those remarks is revealed
Well,
by
Vince
the way...
Cable did say...
Wait.
The two people you don't compare yourself to, presumably.
No, quite. And I think it's absurd. Just because, incidentally, let me give an analogy. Adolf Hitler was in favour of a national health service. Does this mean you and I should be against a national health service because somebody favoured it. And Rand, as you've mentioned, was quite clearly mad in my view. What we're proposing is that common dividends as basic incomes, payments, should be a sharing of our public wealth.
And you identify, and I know you've got a forthcoming book about it, that this is something very British. You trace it to something, the Magna Carta more famously, but the Charter of the Forest in 1217.
The Charter of the Forest of November the 6th, 1217, is one of the most subversive, radical documents of our Constitution and was a marvellous document. It has the distinction of being longer on the British statute books than any other piece of legislation in our history. It was only reformed by Ted Heath in 1971. And the Charter of the Forest said this: every free man has the right to subsistence in this country. Every free man has the right to access the commons, the public spaces, the public resources, in order to have that subsistence. Everybody has a right to work and a right to a home. All of those things we as commoners should own. And gradually, historically, we've had all of those taken away. Given away to elites, establishments, and latterly to multinational corporations.
OK, well, how soon after Corbyn government, or indeed, I don't know, Scottish independence, would Nicola Sturgeon, will the pilot schemes be?
I have recommended in the report that John McDonnell, in his first budget, should put a budget aside for doing a number of pilots around the country.
The first budget.
It'll be in the first budget, but I believe John will do it.
Professor Guy Standing, thank you. After the break. As NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg threatens sanctions against NATO member Turkey, we ask a former ambassador to the nuclear-armed military alliance if NATO is the only obstacle to world peace.
Someone said that you could judge the civilization of a society by visiting its prisons.
And from Britain's Guantanamo Belmarsh prison, where Julian Assange is being held, to the world's largest open-air prison, Gaza. We judge civilizations by their prisons in this week's Broken News. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. Joining me now to go through some of the week's top stories is Editor-in-Chief of Rai Al-Yum, Abdel Bari Atwan. Abdel, thanks for coming back on. Well, in the past 24 hours, we've heard from the first two visitors to Julian Assange of WikiLeaks under arbitrary deprivation, according to the UN. Let's just hear them before we speak.
He knows that he is innocent. He knows that he has done nothing wrong. He knows that he's being persecuted for the simple fact of doing journalistic work. That should be the message that you should relay to the general public.
Editor-in-Chief Christian Haraffenson, Editor-in-Chief of WikiLeaks, with the actor Pamela Anderson, the first two visitors to Belmarsh Prison, about 12 miles from this studio in southeast London. What did you make of the fact that the world's most famous publisher and journalist is now in Belmarsh?
I'm surprised why he is treated like that. He is not a terrorist. He did not commit any crime. No violent crime at all. Why he is actually in confined cells? Why he cannot talk to his family, to his children? You know, I've been covering a lot of stories about terrorists in prison, and I never heard something like this. What's the matter? He's honorable journalist. You know, he changed history. To be treated like this and by the British government in a British prison, I think this is really appalling, and it should be condemned. And public support is really needed in order to put pressure on the government here to change its behavior and treat this man the way he should be treated, as honorable man.
Well, the editor of The Guardian, who was editor who used WikiLeaks, wasn't outside Belmarsh prison, and the media said two Reuters journalists have been released from Myanmar and seem to suggest that this is a bail-skipping man, nothing to do with what you just talked about.
I'm really surprised. Where is the freedom of expression? this country used to be, a castle of freedom of expression. Why the media here is not actually paying attention to this? Why they don't stand with this man who is one of their colleagues? He gave them scoops. The Guardian actually got a huge scoops out of his organization. I'm surprised why they don't demonstrate, why they don't put pressure on the government. He's one of us. He is one of our actually groups. As a journalist, as a media people, we should stick together. We should actually talk to the public. We should mobilize the public in order to support this man.
Well, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in London today. Talks with Theresa May, called Julian Assange a hostile agent, a hostile actor, unlike his boss, President Trump. Let's go to President Trump now, who, of course, once said he loved WikiLeaks. Trump tweeted, once again, Israel faces a barrage of deadly rocket attacks by terrorist groups Hamas and Islamic Jihad. We support Israel 100% in its defense of its citizens. To the Gazan people, these terrorist acts against Israel will bring you nothing but more misery. End the violence and work towards peace. It can happen. What did you make of the tweets?
I was born in Gaza. My family is still in Gaza. We can't imagine the situation they are facing. Israeli bombing them from air, from grounds, from sea. They are starving. There is no electricity. There is no water. There is no medicine for their hospitals. Nothing at all but misery. And here, the leader of the free world, President Trump, saying that stop this terrorism. Who is terrorizing them? Do the Gazan people got F-16, F-15? They got, the strongest fourth army in the world.
Gaza has rockets, as the BBC never tires of reminding us.
Yes,
Israel
Gaza
are
rockets.
merely retaliating.
Yeah, they have cruise missiles. They have, unbelievable. It is a joke. I'm really surprised. They say to the Palestinian, talk. Talk what? They have been talking for 26 years after they signed Oslo agreements. What they got? 800,000 settlers. They got besieged. They got actually, starvation, humiliation, and 65% of unemployment among their young people. So what kind of treatment is this?
Well, Politico ties up the story, perhaps in Donald Trump's mind. Let's go to that story. Trump inches toward military confrontation with Iran, because, of course, Trump has always maintained that Gaza and their rockets are somehow being ordered by the government in Tehran.
But why Iran, for example? He pulled out from the nuclear deal. He actually imposed sanctions against them. So what he wants from Iran?
How will Iran react to the USS Abraham Lincoln arriving in the Persian Gulf? How is Iran going to react?
The problem is, the Americans, they got air base in Adid in Qatar. They got naval base in Bahrain. And now Lincoln is going there, the aircraft carrier is going there. For what? I think there is an attempt from the American to divert attention from the failure to actually prevent the oil from the Iranian oil to be exported and regularly or flowing without any obstruction. It is their failure. They want to cover their failure, and also they want to please these, worried Gulf state leaders who are actually financing the American adventures all over the world.
Well, from the Persian Gulf oil to arguably Libyan oil and David Cameron's war, supported by Theresa May. This from Middle East Eye, how the West's war in Libya has spurred terrorism in 14 countries, including the United Kingdom. Of course, the inquest begins on the London Bridge terror attacks.
All of them coming from Libya. This is the problem. 3,000 of those terrorists actually went to Syria. And look at Libya now. It used to be a stable country. It used to be a prosperous country. And Gaddafi gave them everything. He gave them his nuclear programs. He gave them his chemical weapons. And he paid $3 billion as compensation for the victims of Lockerbie. And on the top of that, they bombed him. And they bombed the country. Half of Libyan population are homeless now in Tunisia and Egypt. And now Libya is a springboard for terrorists
Okay, but do
coming.
you think the intelligence services, MI5 and MI6, are now more understanding of their role in what is being accused of being terrorism here in Britain, being catalyzed in part by our intelligence agencies de facto?
President Obama, at least he was honorable when he regretted participating in this war in his last days in power. But he didn't say it before. But I don't know whether the MI5, MI6 will say, we are sorry, we miscalculated, we actually destroyed a whole country, we participated in a way or another to spread terrorism all over the Middle East and also all over Europe. So this is the mistake they are committed. Whether they regret that, whether they acknowledge that, I'm sure they wouldn't, because usually they never admitted their mistakes.
Abdelbari Atwan, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg used the 25th anniversary of Mediterranean dialogue this week to de facto threaten NATO member Turkey with sanctions over the purchase of Russian air defense systems. This comes in the same week the fully armed UK warship HMS Echo arrived on the Russian border to take part in Ukrainian Navy war games. Joining me now from Berlin in Germany to discuss this build-up of perceived NATO nation aggression is Ambassador Joachim Bitterlich. He was Germany's permanent representative to NATO and National Security Advisor to Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Ambassador, welcome to Going Underground. How would you characterize NATO's current relations with Russia?
When you look back, NATO has been created by deterrence against the Soviet Union. And I think, the Russians have not always behaved, let's say, in a constructive way. It's true. On the other hand, when you look at the past, even the West has done a certain number of mishandlings or mistakes in the relation to the former enemy, the Soviet Union, or to Russia. It's true too. We were not always, let's say, at the top of this relation. And when I look back to the relation to Russia today, for me, it's to some extent unfortunate. And this relates to both sides to some extent. On the one hand, to the neocons on the other side of the Atlantic, on the other side, to Russian home policy.
But the NATO countries are saying we're going to have an increased presence in the Black Sea. Are they all neocons then who don't share your opinion of recent history? I suppose specifically under the Obama administration.
But please, on the other hand, when you look at the presence or in the incidents in the Black Sea, you have to see both sides have their part of responsibility in the increasing incidents, the Russian side as the Ukrainian side. And the problem is really that we missed the real moment where to discuss together what should be the best possible status for Ukraine, for an independent Ukraine, accepted in the beginning by the Russian side, please. And therefore, I think we missed that very moment. But, you know, it's never too late in politics to begin to talk really seriously about, let's say, not only perceptions on both sides, but about the future. I don't see personally a direct threat of Russia against NATO, nor I see a direct threat of NATO against Russia. Not at all. NATO is not against Russia. You have to see the perception in several NATO member states about Russia. And I'm a bit worried about this, that people in these states still fear, to some extent, the Russian neighbor. And I think the Russians should do more to reduce these tensions or this feeling. I know there is a certain feeling in Russia too about encirclement. Yes, I know. I'm aware of this. It's an old Russian feeling. It's traditional. But on the other hand, let's take it, let's say, from the constructive side. What we have not been using in an efficient way, and this is true, is the so-called NATO-Russian Council. We should have done there much more in the sense of, let's say, where are common values, where are common vital interests on both sides. Look, for example, I look at the Middle East. Russia is present in the Middle East, in Syria. Russia is defending, looking after its bases, which are for Russia, independent from Turkey, which are for the Russian conception important. Yes, I understand it. It's a defensive position at the end. But there, I think Russia could be much more active towards a solution of this conflict and should act together with the Americans. I've in mind still, and I have one conviction. It's not proven, I know, but if the Russians and the Americans would have acted in the beginning of the intra-Syrian crisis, and if at that time Lavrov and Kerry would have gone to Damascus and told Bashar al-Assad, please stop your behavior, be quiet, I think we would not have got the Syrian conflict and the civil war within Syria. And I think there has been someone who has been telling to both, to Moscow and to Washington, please abstain from acting there.
Okay, well, I mean, there are a lot of points you're making there. A lot of points you're making there. Obviously, in Syria, as far as Moscow, let alone Beijing, they consider the war won against NATO powers in Syria. And you seriously think now that Moscow will rather get into some rapprochement with this old world rather than seek the new world with Beijing and others after Libya, after Afghanistan, and now attempts at Venezuela? You don't believe that the big powers are now against NATO?
It would be an error to see Moscow too near to Beijing. It's normal that Moscow is looking after Beijing. It's normal with this upcoming world power, China. It's normal. But on the other hand, the natural ally of Russia is still Europe, in my eyes. And I think there it could be still, let's say, a reset of relations between both sides. And I think, yes, there are sanctions which are ongoing because of the Crimea, as we consider this occupation as, let's say, not very legal, as illegitimate. Yugoslavia has been more or less a special case because Russia has been involved till the very last moment, and Russia was at the end abstaining from interfering together with NATO in order to stop that war. On the other hand, I think to each and every one in Moscow it was clear that Milosevic could not survive this conflict. It was clear. But please, I know this old expression says, well, the past is okay. We have seen this. We have been unfortunate to some extent. But when I look really at geopolitics, at the development in the longer run, I think it's in the interest of the Europeans and of Russia to come again together.
Ambassador, thank you. And that's it for the show. Within the past 24 hours, WikiLeaks editor-in-chief Christian Hrafnsson and actor Pamela Anderson visited Britain's Belmarsh prison and claimed Julian Assange's life is now in danger. On Saturday's show, we'll ask the author of a very British coup, Labour politician Chris Mullin, what lengths the establishment can go to suppress truth, justice and Jeremy Corbyn. Until then, keep in touch via social media. Tomorrow is a Victory Day in Russia to mark the defeat of the Nazis. So if you remember Russia's disproportionate role in fighting for the freedom of NATO nations and nations all around the world, wear your St. George's ribbon. See you on Saturday.